So, well, again, welcome. I'll introduce Nish shortly, but I thought just as a way of leading us into the conversation today, Catalyst, we've been supporting, um, a number of our organizational clients to develop more coaching cultures, and as part of that, to develop internal coaching capacity within their organization. And we've done that for many, many years. And so, the purpose of us completing a research report in terms of, we called it taking the temperature of internal coaching, was two things really. One, we really wanted to provide additional insight and I suppose thinking to our corporate clients, the people that are responsible for leading internal coaching within organizations. But we also wanted to provide a I suppose, a useful lens for internal coaches as well, to really help them think about their practice and some things that they may want to pay attention to as well. So that was the intent of our research report. And Nish, who's a partner at Catalyst, really supported us to pull the report together in terms of the findings. So the intent today is Nish and I are going to have a dialogue around the research, and we'll be sharing some of the really interesting findings as well. So, Nish, what would you like to say to introduce yourself to the group?
I think probably most relevant is I've been an internal coach myself for 16 years. Initially in a large organisation where I also co-led the offer, and as part of that, had to do some of the thinking around, what makes for a good internal coaching offer. We had a hybrid of jobs plus coaches and full-time coaches. What was needed for the individuals and also for the organisation around that. So I've kind of lived it, I guess, Damion, and I'm now in a much smaller organisation and kind of introducing coaching in a space where people are less aware. And kind of there was a journey that I had to go on in terms of education. And then on the other side, living the role myself. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation with you. And I have lots of personal lenses to add, but also in pulling the report together with you, I think it was really helpful to see some of that lived experience being captured and normalized through conversation with others as well, and the themes that are emerging around internal coaching in the UK.
Mm. Yeah, thanks, Nish. Thank you. And just say you're also a partner at Catalyst, aren't you? So
I
part
am
of our
indeed.
faculty team as well. And um, it's really important to me that Nish is with us because she does bring the realities of practicing as an internal coach as well as an external coach. I haven't been an internal coach now for a long time, so it's important for our team to have Nish's voice there. Um, so just before we share anything more in terms of the report, for those who haven't downloaded the report yet, just to say that on our website, which hopefully you can see on the screen now, if you click on coach training and then click on coach training for organizations, you'll find this page. And if you scroll down, you can download the report here. So, following this conversation, it may be a useful resource for you, especially if you're making a case for internal coaching within your organization or supporting internal coaches, or you as an internal coach thinking about making a case for what you need as well. So we carried out the research and we had 69 coaches complete the research. Um, and there was quite an even split actually between private and public sector. I mean, private sector was slightly more, I think around about 56%, I want to say, or 54% were private sector, and the rest were coaches from public sector organizations. So we had a large sample in terms of the number of organizations that the coaches were employed by. But I think what was really important for me as I started to look at the research, Nish, was the maturity of the internal coaches. So, 65% of them had been coaching for a minimum of 5 years, and actually quite a number of them had extensive practice as well. So it's a good solid base in terms of, I suppose, their experiences that was really brought to bear in terms of the report. Um, so should we just start perhaps with um, suppose some initial reflections from you, and then I can add some thoughts in terms of some of the key
Yeah.
things that the report really spoke to.
I mean, I think, unsurprisingly, but it's always lovely to see is just how important the internal coach is for the internal coach role is for internal coaches and what it creates in terms of a sense of belonging. So for me, one of the important findings in the report was, I think two-thirds of the coaches that we spoke with said holding the role enhanced their relationship with the organization. And that feeling of being part of something bigger and giving back and the satisfaction that the internal coaches get from the role is huge. Um, and so there's a lot of upside to it for the coaches as well as to the organization. But then it was thinking about in that context, what are also some of the challenges that the internal coaches face? And actually things that are in the gift of sponsors and organizations to think more and differently about that might ease some of the challenge for the internal coaches, but also add to the benefit for the business. And I think that for me was the biggest kind of macro lens going through the report was there's more opportunity available to organizations who have an internal coaching offer. And I think small changes could make a big difference in a number of areas that we identified.
Mm. Yeah, no, thanks, Liz. And I just want to say, and the majority of the coaches were what Liz called job plus coaches. So,
Mm,
they're not full-time internal coaches. Actually, we're doing coaching alongside their full-time role. And for some organizations, that was included in terms of their role. For many organizations, that was, I mean this respectfully, but magic time where they found the time in addition to their day job. And I was really struck by, the consistent theme around purpose and meaning.
yeah,
Like you say, two-thirds of them, the way they were talking in terms of, well, some quotes in the report, this is the most meaningful part of my role. And I think that discretionary effort is fantastic. Um, but, what the report was pointing to, unless there's that balance of exchange in terms of some of the hygiene factors that need to be in place for internal coaching to really flourish, um, potentially that's going to become a challenge in time in terms of eroding that discretionary effort.
yeah. I mean, when we spoke about it before, we talked a lot about this sense of sustainability. And, how do you ensure that the energy and the enthusiasm and the discretionary effort continues and can put measures around to ensure that when it is additional time that people are giving, actually they feel that time is meaningful and it's respected, and in a lot of cases that it is rewarded, and that doesn't have to be financial, but it has to be in terms of a sense of the organization understanding the investment that the individual is making. And also on the other side, the individual understanding the investment the organization is making too. I think it's both.
Mm,
Because to set up an internal coaching offer takes a lot, and for it to truly make a difference, it's not just the offer itself, but it's everything that goes around it in terms of how it aligns to the organizational strategy, how it sits in the context of other offers, around development and talent management. I mean, Damien, it was really interesting to see, like, and understandably so in some ways, that there is still a struggle in terms of what coaching is and what coaching isn't. And I think that's an important place to start and keep coming back to, both for the organization and for internal coaches, because coaching is still relatively new as a vehicle to help people develop.
mm. Yeah, no, thanks, Nish. And there's so much in there already in terms of what you're sharing. And I remember when I was reading through the research, one of the themes that really came out from the coaches was in many cases the challenge without that sponsorship.
Yeah.
So often the line manager um, reprioritizing their time away from coaching. Understandably, they have a day job that they need to deliver, but without that organizational support, a number of coaches were reporting it's very difficult for them to actually invest the time into coaching. Um, and a large percentage of them were actually naming the fact that this is one of the sort of ongoing challenges, that the pressure in their organization is now starting to increase over the last year, and actually therefore their ability to prioritize being an internal coach was actually being affected.
Yeah.
Mm,
Absolutely. I mean, I remember when we set up the offer in my previous organization, and sponsorship was key because actually ensuring that people value the time that's being spent in these conversations, both from the internal coach and the coachee, and time is held, and also that there is a sense of understanding what comes out of these conversations and kind of how people embed change in the business. So
mm,
having that sponsorship is critical. And when you have people who really understand in the organization what coaching is and the power it has, they become advocates. And so there is an education piece, I think, around an internal coaching offer.
mm,
That's incredibly important because when you have good internal coaches in place that are supported, kind of the return, both from the perspective of the individual, but also how they contribute to culture.
mm,
One of the things that is clear as well is that the skill set that you develop as an internal coach is transferable into how you lead and how
mm,
you engage with clients. So that those are other returns to the benefit of having an internal coaching program and offer if it's respected.
mm. Yeah, yeah, and like you're saying, one of the things we always try and encourage the organization to do is also to be very clear around how the internal coaching is meeting the organizational strategy. So where it's being used rather than it's a reactive provision where people are just, approaching for coaching when they need it. Because often that's when there's some challenges, as we saw coming through in the report, in terms of the coachee readiness,
Yes.
and actually what the organisation were doing to prepare the coachees before they actually approached and were given the coach to work with. Uh,
Yeah.
so I suppose some of that sort of process that needs to be in place. I also wanted to just reflect back what you were saying because um, again, the internal coaches were a number of them were a large percentage of them were articulating the fact that because of the organizational insight that they had being part of the system as well, just the value that they could bring to your point around the organizational culture. So I'm sure we'll talk about supervision in a moment, but that ability to feed back organizational themes and
Yes.
those themes to be fed back into whether that's the leadership or talent management strategy or OD strategy, as well as obviously making sure that the internal coaches are then trained to be able to work with those themes.
Yeah. I think both those parts, Damien, are so important because actually internal coaches have access to a sense of the social and emotional dynamics that support an organisation. It's a privileged place to be, actually, in terms of some of the conversations you get to have once you build trust. And so the insights that you gain about themes that might run across an organisation in terms of, from the very practical, how effective performance management is to well-being.
Mm,
That there's some really rich insight that could really help an organisation to continue to retain and develop their best people if it's mined in the right way. But on the other hand, because internal coaches have access, and that's a challenge for an internal coaching offer, they have access to information that they then hold in different contexts. Things like supervision and CPD become so important. I mean, I think we had 77% or 72%, no, 77% of coaches talk about the importance of supervision, about peer support, about CPD in terms of it helping them to hold some of the really important stuff that their coachees bring into conversation.
mm. Yeah, yeah, and just how vital that is when, like you say,
Yeah,
they're part of the system and potentially carrying things about the organization, about the individuals in the organization, outside of the coaching. So actually, that space for them to stay clean as a coach, but also like yeah, to be able to report that back through well supervision as such. And I know from reading the report again, that again was one of the themes that we saw coming through about the importance of supervision, but also coaches wanting to be able to access it more regularly as well,
yeah,
rather than just once a quarter, which a number of I suppose the majority of the coaches were doing. Just from your perspective, Nish, just what were some of the themes that the internal coaches were working on? And I just want to add at this point, the majority of the internal coaches surveys were working one to one.
Yeah,
But there were also some coaches that were working with groups and teams as well. But from a one-to-one perspective, what were some of the themes that you saw that
yeah.
the coaches were meeting?
I mean, I think what I was really struck by is 46% of coaches talked about um, well-being, and in particular, helping their clients to regulate emotions being a core part of the work that they do.
Mm,
And if you think about the stress and distress that a number of people are facing kind of in the world and then in their organizations, it's quite telling, but not surprising that that's a key topic that comes into coaching and to internal coaches. Um, just balancing that out for a second though, Damien, with the fact that 28% of them felt um, challenged to effectively support some of the people that they were working with around confidence and emotional well-being.
mm,
That for me speaks to what we touched on in terms of ensuring that coaches have internal coaches have the right support, in supervision and CPD. Because
mm,
actually, the reality is coaches are often a first point of contact, internal coaches, um, for some sensitive stuff that people might be experiencing.
mm, mm,
And so having them well trained means that actually people access support in a way they might not otherwise at all.
mm, mm,
So that was a big theme. Another big theme was around career development, career transitions. Um, and I guess there's an edge there in terms of performance management. So the risk is if internal coaching isn't structured in the right way and communicated in the right way, that people bring in internal coaches and external coaches, but mainly internal coaches as a substitute for performance management. So
mm.
how do you get the balance right between what sits with an internal coach around career and transitions and what might need to be owned by the business?
Yeah, and in some ways that's why, as an internal coach, following similar process perhaps to an external coach and having three-way
Exactly.
conversations, because the organization will often assume that the internal coach understands, but actually so nuanced, isn't it? So actually having those three-way meetings are so important. And the piece you were talking about earlier again just sparked a thought in me because I remember reading that the internal coaches there was quite a large concern around being able to support coaches in stress and
Yeah.
um, boundaries with obviously therapy and mental health, etc. were some of the areas of concern that the internal coaches were raising in terms of making sure that they were able to deal with that when they face that in their practice.
Absolutely. And there's a sense that if you've got somebody coming to you with issues around mental health and well-being, you know, what you cannot do is say, nope, can't have this conversation. I'm really sorry. I've got to move you on because I'm not ready for it. So how you navigate that is incredibly important because people are being vulnerable and expressing a need. And that's why supporting coaches with the right level of supervision and training and ongoing development is critical around this because I think people are increasingly facing stress and distress in the workplace.
Mm,
And then, this is a place where people can bring some of that need too.
mm. And again, reason why the coaches need regular supervision to make
Yeah.
sure that they're, being able to resource themselves in their practice. I just saw a question come through about what organizations were the coaches working for. All I can say is they were large corporate organizations across the private and public sector. And it was a large number of organizations as well.
But some of the results were quite consistent. And I think that's the other piece is whether it's a small organization or a larger one, public or private sector, I think some of the themes that we're touching on exist regardless.
Mm. And so, I suppose, just from your experience then, Nish, let me ask you this from as an internal coach, what were some of I suppose, the key insights for your practice that you took away from reading the research?
Yeah, I think for me, clarity, kind of ensuring there's clarity around the offer and where it sits um, in the business is really important so that people can access coaching in the right way. So what is coaching? What isn't it? Why would I come to coaching as opposed to a particular training offer? And I also think clarity around, how coaching supports the strategy of the business. So for me, it's really important that whatever's offered from an internal coaching perspective aligns with where the business is going and what the people strategy is. And people being able to see that link and having that sponsorship because there are senior individuals that understand that link is incredibly important. So clarity and education would be two things that kind of I pay attention to, but maybe not as consistently as I should. And this report really triggered for me the need to keep coming back to it because I think the people that we work with in an organization are incredibly busy. So kind of whilst it's clear, and I read this about leadership as well, you have the importance of repetition. I think there is something to keep coming back to in terms of for sponsors in an organization, um, what's the offer and why is the offer in place? But also kind of for individual coaches with your coachees, it's something you can keep coming back to gain that clarity because that clarity creates safety and trust.
Mm-mm. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And I mean, I just want to, I suppose, add in around that sort of clarity. Um, I think the key thing for me was there seemed to be reading the research, the organizations have thought quite well in terms of the support they were providing their coaches. So the ongoing CPD, the internal supervision that was being received, and a lot of bespoke in that to meet the needs of the internal coaches. But what
Yeah.
still seemed to be there, and I appreciate this has always been a challenge for internal coaches, is
Yeah.
really the clarity on the give and the get between
Yes.
the individual's line manager, perhaps, and the sponsor of the coaching in terms of that real permission to coach, you know. So I know for well your one of your previous organization did very well in terms of that sort of contracting around the time that would be committed to
Absolutely.
the job plus coaching role. But again, reading the research, that seemed to be lacking and missing from a number of the organizations, from the coaches that we surveyed.
Yeah. I mean, I think it was so important when we set up that offer, kind of part of people applying for the role was actually a conversation with their performance manager so that there was a clear understanding across the different levels as to what the role required and a commitment from every party to support the internal coach in delivering on the role.
Mm.
Um, but also, Damien, I'm really aware, kind of understandably, we're looking at edges. So in this conversation, we're looking at the edges presented through the internal coach report. I think a lot of organizations are doing brilliant stuff in terms of setting up internal coaching programs. And I think it still needs revisiting regularly because things change, leadership changes, strategy changes, and it should be quite agile in organizations. And so revisiting where coaching sits in that context on a regular basis becomes increasingly important. And a decade ago, you'd set something up and then you could hold it for a chunk of time. But now, I think kind of with the pace of movement, the organization needs to pay attention to it more regularly. And I think for internal coaches too, there's a bit about how do you contract and recontract with the organization in that context and help raise awareness of what you're doing, where you're struggling, where you're finding actually really positive impact. Because all of those help make more informed decisions about where coaching is offered and how it's offered and who it's offered to. And that's what we want, really. Um, that level of reflection, not just the practice.
Mm. Well, and also the level of responsibility in the
Yeah,
line, as well as the internal coach and the coachee. So the coachee's line manager is still holding their responsibility in terms of whether that's performance management or what else that the line manager needs to do to ensure that the coachee can make the change that's required.
yeah, absolutely.
Mm. And again, I mean, you're sort of answering this, but from an organizational perspective,
Mm.
what else would you say you would be taking from the report, Nish, when you think about your own organization and internal coaching?
I think, I mean, it all sits at the heart of commitment and education for me, but almost from an organizational perspective, it's really understanding the value that coaching can bring and why you're offering coaching in a particular context. And where there is a coachee, how is the coachee's um, needs being identified through the business rather than the coachee coming to coaching and saying, well, I've been told to come and see a coach, but I don't really know what I'm coming to this conversation for. I think there is a step that needs to be owned between the performance manager of the coachee and the coachee themselves. So there's clarity around what the need is before people come into coaching.
Mm.
And organizations, and I'm repeating myself a little bit, but I think busyness is a big factor here. And so kind of creating time and processes to almost counterbalance some of that busyness is important.
Mm. Yeah, because there's always the coaches, it's a limited resource, isn't it? So thinking
Absolutely.
about the best place to target them to have the biggest impact for the individuals, the leader, whether that's leaders or not, but the organization is good for not just the organization, the leaders, but also the coaches, because then they can understand the value that they're really bringing rather than it's, hard work in terms of really getting the coachee to fully understand what coaching is and that taking a number of sessions before they can really, do some richer work together.
Yeah, absolutely. Damien, I've been doing this for so many years, and I came across somebody the other day who kind of kept saying to me, "But I don't understand. What can I get from coaching?" And they'd come to me on the basis of we know coaching is a good thing,
Mm,
but that lack of clarity creates a gap in the conversation, and you're dancing around that gap, and you can't do good work as an internal coach without that sense of what we're working together on, and you can't build trust either.
mm,
Both of which are incredibly important in terms of creating movement.
mm.
So I completely agree. I
Yeah,
kind of think,
and it's also, I was going to jump in because you sort of saw
yeah,
that come through with some coaches being aligned with leadership courses, so they were given uh, participants of the leadership courses to work with, but the participants weren't really briefed on what coaching is, the purpose of coaching, how to really maximize their experience, and that was
absolutely.
left to the coach to, do that educational piece. And I'm not saying that's not required, but again, what the organization can do to really set those expectations.
Yeah, because what otherwise you have is people starting one step out and
Mm,
probably starting from a place of uncertainty and fear. So
mm,
their willingness to engage, their ability to engage is reduced. And there's some easy things an organization can do to bridge that gap. And there's also things the internal coach can do.
mm,
And one of the things I like about the research and what we've done with it is kind of what we've left sponsors and internal coaches with is some questions to reflect on around just that. What sits with me, kind of that's in my gift to change or evolve that might help kind of in the round ensure that internal coaching is received in the best way possible.
mm. Thank you, Nish. And you've bridged us very nicely to come towards the end of the session because I'm conscious of time, and I know we're both passionate about this, so we could probably talk for another hour or so.
Absolutely.
So I hope that's been useful reflections for everybody listening. Please do download the report if you haven't seen it. And as Nish was just saying, there's some key questions that can enable you to reflect on your proposition as an internal coach, but also if you're a leader of internal coaching as well.